The grain silos of ancient Egypt weren't just storage facilities. They were the world's first central banks. And the system they created 4,000 years ago is still embedded in every modern economy today. But here's the part that will shock you. The civilization that mastered economic stability for 3 millennia collapsed the moment they forgot their own principles. And the warning signs they missed are appearing in our world right now. When you think of ancient Egypt, you picture pyramids, pharaohs, and golden tombs. But the real power of Egypt wasn't built on monuments, it was built on wheat. For over 3,000 years, longer than any empire in human history, Egypt dominated the ancient world not through military conquest, but through economic control. They understood something that modern governments are still struggling with. Real wealth isn't measured in gold, it's measured in food security, predictable systems, and the ability to survive crisis. The Nile River flooded every year between July and September, depositing nutrient-rich silt across the valley. This wasn't luck, it was geological clockwork. Egyptian farmers planted wheat and barley after the floods receded, harvested in spring, and repeated the cycle. Year after year, century after century, the Nile delivered. Egypt became the breadbasket of the ancient world, producing such massive grain surpluses that neighboring kingdoms depended on Egyptian exports to survive. But surplus alone doesn't create stability. Plenty of civilizations grew food and collapsed anyway. Egypt's genius was in what they did with that surplus. They built the world's first centralized economic system, and at its heart was something revolutionary, the state granary system. Every farmer in Egypt paid taxes, but not in coins, they paid in grain. After harvest, a percentage of every crop was collected and stored in massive state-controlled granaries scattered across the kingdom. These weren't just warehouses, they were economic fortresses. Scribes meticulously recorded every bushel that entered and left. The records were so detailed that archaeologists have found tablets listing grain transactions from over 4,000 years ago, down to the exact amounts. This system gave the pharaohs something no other ancient ruler possessed: economic predictability. They knew exactly how much grain the kingdom held at any moment. They could calculate how long the population could survive if the Nile failed to flood. And crucially, they could manipulate the grain supply to stabilize prices, prevent famine, and control the population. Think about that for a moment. While other Bronze Age kingdoms relied on barter, tribute, and chaos, Egypt had created a proto-central bank. The granaries didn't just store food, they stored economic power. When grain prices spiked during shortages, the state released reserves to prevent famine and riots. When prices crashed during abundant harvests, they stockpiled excess to prepare for lean years. It was supply and demand management for 1,000 years before Adam Smith, and here's where it gets even more fascinating. Egypt didn't use money for most of its history. Coins weren't introduced until the Persians conquered Egypt in 525 BC, nearly 3,000 years after the pyramids were built. Instead, grain itself became the standard unit of value. Wages were paid in grain, debts were calculated in grain. Even luxury goods were priced relative to grain equivalents. Imagine trying to run a modern economy without currency. It sounds impossible. But Egypt made it work because grain had something most currencies lack: intrinsic value. You can't eat gold. You can't survive on silver, but grain keeps you alive. And because the state controlled the granaries, they controlled the economy without needing coins. This system had a side effect that changed history: stability. For 3,000 years, Egypt's government remained remarkably consistent. Pharaohs rose and fell, dynasties changed, but the grain system endured. Other ancient civilizations collapsed into chaos every few generations. Egypt didn't, and the reason was simple. As long as the granaries were full, the people were fed, the economy was stable, and rebellion was rare. But the stability came with a cost. The state's control over grain meant absolute control over survival. If you defied the pharaoh, you could be cut off from grain rations. If a region rebelled, the granaries could be closed, starving them into submission. The granaries system wasn't just economic policy, it was political power in its rawest form. And then, of course, there was Joseph. The biblical story recorded in the book of Genesis tells of a Hebrew slave who rose to become vizier of Egypt by interpreting Pharaoh's dream. 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph's solution was classic Egyptian economic strategy. stockpile grain during the good years to survive the bad ones. Whether the story is literal history or legend, it reflects a real Egyptian practice. They had been doing this for centuries before Joseph's time. The genius of Egypt's system becomes even clearer when you compare it to their neighbors. Mesopotamia, the other great Bronze Age civilization, relied on a completely different model. Mesopotamian city-states used silver as currency and operated on credit systems managed by temple priests and merchant guilds. It was more flexible than Egypt's grain-based economy, allowing for complex trade and loans, but it was also more fragile. When droughts hit Mesopotamia, grain prices exploded. The poor went into debt, sold themselves into slavery, or starved. Kingdoms collapsed, wars erupted over water and farmland. Mesopotamia's history is a cycle of boom and catastrophic bust. Egypt's history, by contrast, is eerily stable. The granaries system absorbed shocks that would have shattered other civilizations, but even Egypt wasn't invincible, and the cracks in the system appeared in ways that echo modern economies. The first problem was corruption. The granaries were managed by a vast bureaucracy of scribes, overseers, and priests. And wherever there is bureaucracy, there is opportunity for theft. Tomb inscriptions and papyrus records reveal cases of officials skimming grain, falsifying records, or selling state reserves for personal profit. One famous case from the reign of Ramses IX involved granary officials in Thebes who were caught embezzling massive quantities of grain. The scandal reached so high into the government that the vizier himself was implicated. The punishment was brutal. Officials were beaten, exiled, or executed. But the corruption never fully stopped. The system was too large, too complex, and too dependent on human honesty. The second problem was complacency. For centuries, the Nile flooded reliably. Harvests were abundant. The granaries stayed full. And slowly, Egypt's leaders began to take the system for granted. Maintenance on irrigation canals was delayed. Investments in agricultural infrastructure declined. The bureaucracy grew bloated and inefficient. When the Nile's floods began to weaken during the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BC, Egypt wasn't prepared. Climate records show that the eastern Mediterranean entered a prolonged drought during this period. The Nile's floods became irregular, harvests shrank, and for the first time in centuries, the granaries began to empty. The state tried to compensate by tightening control, raising taxes, and rationing grain more strictly. But the population was growing, and the system couldn't keep up. This is when Egypt's enemies saw their chance. The Sea Peoples, a mysterious coalition of displaced populations, possibly driven by the same drought, invaded the eastern Mediterranean around 1177 BC. They smashed the Hittite Empire, leveled cities across the Levant, and attacked Egypt's delta. Pharaoh Ramses III repelled them, but the cost was staggering. Egypt's economy was drained, the granaries were depleted, and the kingdom entered a slow decline it would never fully reverse. But here's the crucial lesson. Egypt didn't collapse because of military defeat. They collapsed because their economic system, the granary network that had sustained them for 3,000 years, finally failed. And once it failed, everything else unraveled. Wages couldn't be paid. Workers went on strike. The first recorded labor strike in history happened in Egypt during this period. The government lost legitimacy. Regional governors hoarded grain for themselves. The centralized system fractured into localized economies. By the time Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC, the granary system still existed, but it was a shadow of its former self. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed tried to revive it, and for a time, they succeeded. Under Greek rule, Egypt once again became the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, exporting grain to Rome and Athens. But the control was never as absolute, the stability never as enduring. Rome learned from Egypt. The Roman Empire adopted a grain distribution system, the annona, that fed the city of Rome for centuries. Free grain was distributed to Roman citizens, paid for by taxes collected from Egypt and North Africa. It was Egypt's model, scaled up to imperial size. And like Egypt, Rome's stability depended on keeping the grain flowing. When the supply was disrupted, riots erupted, emperors fell. Fast forward to today, and the echoes are impossible to ignore. Modern central banks don't store grain. They control currency, but the principle is identical. A centralized authority managing supply to prevent chaos. When inflation spikes, Central banks raise interest rates to cool the economy. When recessions hit, they flood the system with liquidity. It's the same playbook Egypt used 4,000 years ago, just with dollars instead of wheat. But the risks are the same too: corruption, complacency, and the illusion of invincibility. Egypt's granaries seemed eternal until they weren't. Modern financial systems seem uncheckable until they collapse. And when they do, the consequences ripple across entire civilizations. There's another parallel worth noting. Egypt's system worked because grain had intrinsic value. You could eat it. Modern currencies have no intrinsic value. They exist because governments say they do. That's called fiat currency, and it only works as long as people trust the system. Egypt's system collapsed when droughts made grain scarce. Modern economies collapse when trust evaporates. The 2008 financial crisis is a perfect example. Banks had created complex financial instruments backed by nothing solid, much like a granary filled with imaginary wheat. When people realized the system was hollow, trust vanished overnight, credit froze, markets crashed. Governments had to flood the economy with currency to prevent total collapse. It worked, barely, but the underlying fragility remains. Egypt also teaches us about the danger of centralization. For 3,000 years, centralized control was Egypt's strength. But when the system failed, there was no backup, no alternative. Everything depended on the granaries, and when they emptied, the entire civilization teetered. Modern economies face the same risk. Too big to fail banks, centralized supply chains, and interconnected financial systems create efficiency in good times. But in crisis, they become points of catastrophic failure. The final lesson from Egypt is this: stability is not the same as strength. Egypt's granary system created one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. But that stability made them vulnerable in ways they didn't recognize. They stopped innovating, they stopped adapting. And when the environment changed, they couldn't respond fast enough. Modern economies are obsessed with stability. Central banks promise to smooth out boom and bust cycles. Governments stockpile reserves and backstop failing institutions. And for a while, it works, but stability breeds complacency. And complacency is the prelude to collapse. So where does that leave us? Egypt's story isn't a blueprint for a disaster, it's a warning. The systems we build to protect ourselves can become the chains that bind us. The granaries that fed Egypt for millennia eventually starved them when the Nile failed. The central banks that stabilize modern economies could trap us in fragility we don't yet understand. The difference between Egypt and us is simple. They had 3,000 years to learn their lessons. We don't. The next crisis, whether it's climate, currency, or something we haven't imagined, will test whether we've learned anything from history, or whether we'll repeat Egypt's mistakes in real time. If this changed the way you see money, hit subscribe. History always has the answers.